Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jennifer New, and I'm the Associate Director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Iowa. And Obermann Conversations is a program that we co-sponsor with our friends at the Iowa City Public Library with the intention of bringing voices from scholars and artists on the University of Iowa campus into conversation with people from the community around shared topics of interest and passion and expertise. So tonight we're going to be talking about Anne Frank. But just before we get into introductions, I wanted to mention our upcoming Obermann Conversations that we currently have scheduled. So on December 2nd, we'll be talking about economic development as social justice. And then on February 4th, we will be discussing reproductive justice. So I hope you can join us. If you go to the Obermann Center's website, you can find links to those. So tonight, we're joined by 4 different guests who will be thinking with us about the kind of legacy and contemporary relevance of Anne Frank. So first we have Kirsten Kumpf-Bale, who is a scholar of Anne Frank, who teaches in the German department at the University of Iowa, and wrote a proposal that she will be sharing more information about regarding bringing a tree to campus this spring that was propagated from a tree outside of the annex in Amsterdam that Anne and her family and others could see from that hiding place. We're also joined by University of Iowa undergraduate business student, Megan Malary, who was a student in Kirsten's class, Anne Frank and Her Story, and also served as an honors practicum assistant in that class. Mallory Hellman is the director of the Iowa Youth Writing Project. And IYWP, as you'll be hearing a little bit more about, is sponsoring a writing competition related to the tree and to Anne. And finally, we are joined by Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz of Agudas Achim Synagogue. And in addition to that position, she is also, as I understand, somebody from Amsterdam, and so also has a relationship to this story that comes from her own kind of geographical experience. So thank you all so much for being here. I wanted to start with Kirsten because Kirsten, you're really in many ways the reason that we are all here. And I've had the pleasure of working with Kirsten for the past, 10 months on planning for the planting of this tree, which will occur on April 29th. And I think, Kirsten, as I've been telling out in the community, telling people about this, the question comes up of like, why and how, why this tree? Why did you want it to come to Iowa City, and how did this come about?
Thank you, Jennifer, for that question. I think I'll start off with a quote, a passage from Anne Frank. In one of her lesser known works, Tales of the Secret Annex, which is a collection a lot of people aren't that familiar with. It's a collection of assorted pieces of prose and fiction and nonfiction that Anne Frank wrote in addition to the diary. And in this, in one particular piece, she stresses the personal value of asking. And her words are, "You won't know until you ask." I believe that if everyone asked themselves why before they did something, they'd be much better persons. And I have to say, I found myself at the same intersection of action and reflection that Anne acknowledges in this tale that she wrote. Why? When I started to consider, should I do this? I found out that there were a few trees that have been planted that stem from the original tree in Amsterdam, as Jennifer mentioned. And Anne references that tree a few times in her diary. The tree had a very long life. It lived until 2010. And then it was getting quite ill. And then it ended up falling down due to a storm. And it is at that moment where world-renowned arborists and members of the city of Amsterdam really wanted to save that tree and propagate saplings from it. And so when I read about that, when I learned about that, I found myself in this moment, and I wanted to pose I wanted myself to ask, why could I do this? Could I do this, as Anne mentioned? And so I wanted this tree to be planted right here in Iowa City. My efforts, I believe, to establish a strong link between the University of Iowa and the larger Iowa City area, the larger Jewish community, and the voice of conscience that is Anne, spans a number of years and has actually crossed a few of my academic avenues. And one of the efforts I put into place is right here at the University of Iowa. So I created a general education course, Anne Frank and Her Story, and it's in the category of diversity and inclusion. And that particular seminar focuses on Anne, other child and adolescent writers during occupied Europe, but it also focuses on contemporary issues, human rights issues, and the act of storytelling. How do individuals represent their personal histories and narratives and celebrate a shared humanity, both in past years and today? And so my teaching, my research, my community involvement, I realized I stand at this pivotal moment in history. I have heard survivors of the Holocaust speak. I actually was born in the year that Otto Frank died. When I hear the word secret annex and helper figures, I associate both with a historical moment unprecedented. And in that sense, these historical events permeated my childhood, my schooling, conversations at the dinner table. But today, when I engage with my students who sit in my classroom, and when I talk to other individuals in the community, both here and abroad, I start to recognize that there are parts of Anne's story, large parts of Anne's story, that individuals don't know, large parts of the Holocaust that individuals don't know. And, I want to be careful because I don't believe that this reality should be a blame on ignorance, but in my opinion, I guess it's a call for pedagogical action. And so in talking with my students and finding out about this opportunity, I decided to go for it. And I wanted to see if I could get this tree to come to the University of Iowa, to Iowa City, to the state of Iowa, to the heartland here in the United States, to think about, from my standpoint as an educator, what can I do to help grow more awareness? And a living monument of Anne, a sapling in Iowa City, I think would allow Anne's story to develop organically, to blossom, to produce new fruit for future students, for faculty members, for community members here in this location. And so I think I had to follow the why. And Anne follows actually the quote that I mentioned earlier. She said, "You won't know until you ask." And so I asked. I put together a proposal. I got numerous individuals to whom I'm indebted to support my proposal. And that outpouring of support from my community and the rallying around this tree has taken my breath away. I think we are prepared. We're organizing, we're planning, we're prepared to welcome Anne's tree to Iowa City with open arms and utmost respect. And I think it's the right fit for our community. It would be planted on it will be planted on the most revered place on campus, the Pentacrest, the location of the first Capitol in the state of Iowa. It was named to the National Register of Historic Places in the 70s. It's this unique point where campus and city are come together seamlessly. And so I think, Anne's tree will come to a really, really special place. It'll also join other historical trees. This is the UNESCO City of Literature, and it's the first one in the Western Hemisphere. It's also the first city to elect a Jewish mayor. So I just feel like there's so much that makes this place particularly fitting. And then I also think of the moment, and I feel that the sapling is coming at the most opportune moment. We all right now are yearning for inspiration and hope. The times have been challenging, formative, but very challenging. And so I see the sapling also as a unique opportunity to connect past, present, future. I think symbolically, it's beautiful. The tree stems from the original root of the tree in Amsterdam that Anne witnessed outside of her window, but it's going to be growing in soil here in Iowa. So it's genetically tied to the story in the past, but at the same time, it serves as this distinctive living memorial that will shed light on our community today.
Thank you. Can you just briefly tell us where your own connection to Anne Frank and Anne as a point of a topic of your study?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually did dissertation research at the University of Ghent in Belgium. I was a research scholar there. And while I was there, I had this unique opportunity to travel. I was in a place that I could get to numerous countries very easily. And I always was interested, my doctorate is in German studies, but I was always interested in learning more about the experiences of those in the occupied countries. And I also just really wanted to know more about Anne Frank because I had read her in my in secondary school, but it was a blip. I didn't feel like I got very much context, historical context for sure. I wasn't able to really, grapple with her story and ask a lot of questions because I think we covered her in a day and a half. And so I wanted to explore that story, but also learn about other stories that are like Anne's. And so the adolescent child vantage point was really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting because last week I went to Hillel here on campus to talk to some of the students about this project. And I asked how many of you have read the diary, and 2 of them had read the diary, of the students who were there. So it is interesting to kind of, hear who has read it and how much have they read it. So I wanted to transfer to Megan. So Megan, I'm curious, you took Kirsten's class, and then you were an honors practicum. So I'm guessing that means that you were kind of involved in the class twice, once as a student and once as a practicum. And I'm curious, both kind of what called you to sign up for it, and then as you read the diary and worked through different materials in the class, what surprised you? What had you not known before that kind of came to light?
Yes, absolutely. So I took the course in spring of 2020 and then was able to help assistant teach this past spring in the spring of 21. And what drew me to the class initially was the fact that I had never read Anne Frank's diary. I am from Denver, Colorado, and part of our curriculum was reading night, but I had never read her diary, so I had some background with the Holocaust. And so I also am an international business student, so I really wanted to expand my horizons more. And I thought that this class would be a great opportunity to do just that. And when I first took it, I really just saw it as a history course. But by the end, I realized that it was more about learning from the past and using that to approach the present and the future. And so the way the course was structured was that we read memoirs by young Holocaust victims, including Anne, as well as survivors. And then we also had history that we learned as for context about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And then we also had a part of another aspect was reading news reports and submitting those reflections on those. So again, that kind of really put these memoirs not only just approaching them at a face value, but getting the context and the history behind them, and then also looking to the future and the present in what's happening today surrounding these issues. And so, like me, many other students had never read Anne's diary before, and maybe also weren't as familiar with the history of the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism. In particular, many students didn't know just how far-reaching this hatred was and how much of a tie it had in history. It's been referred to history's oldest hatred and has its origins in medieval Europe. So a lot of students were unaware that this had been going on for centuries, and just how far it went with the propaganda and scapegoating. And it was really shocking, I think, for a lot of us. And it kind of had us questioning what is being selected as curriculum in schools, whose perspective are we being taught, and what is left out of classrooms. I think it's easy to think that when you're in a classroom setting, you're learning everything there is to know, but a lot of perspectives are often left off the table. And so then we took it a step further and kept up with news, both world news, and then we also looked at local instances of anti-Semitism for one assignment. And a lot of us were shocked to learn that it's happening in our communities today still. And so we really had these uncomfortable but really necessary conversations about anti-Semitism and really the consequences of hatred going unchecked. And we kind of wanted to reflect this back in Anne's diary on the importance of helpers and bystanders. When Anne was in the secret annex, they were helped by non-Jewish individuals who risked their lives to hide these families. And I think it just goes to show that you can always choose to do the right thing. And one quote that stuck out to me by Anne from her diary was how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. And I think that starts by just being informed and aware, and then using that awareness and information to inform others, because that's how change can be made and how hatred can be checked, and making sure that we're contributing to our communities. And so I think by seeing this experience through the eyes of an individual, especially a young girl, really allowed us to, maybe if we had just learned about the history of the Holocaust, maybe would have not had as much empathy and understanding as we would by taking this course and seeing it through the eyes of individuals, especially young people. And one other unique aspect of the class was that we kind of talked about documenting history in the past and using that for the future as well. And in the spring of 2020 was when we were sent home and experienced isolation, and Professor Kirsten Campbell really encouraged us to use writing as a really important tool in a similar way to how Anne has really made an impact on the world.
Thank you. And thank you for that also beautiful transition to talk to Mallory about the Iowa Youth Writing Project's part in this. And I know, Megan, you actually helped teach a workshop this winter for teens. So if you have responses to this question too, after Mallory, please jump in. So Mal, it'd be wonderful, first of all, just to hear about, just to let people know about the competition. And then I'm curious, I think sometimes it gets derided as like, a young girl writing in a notebook who was probably, not very, very good, and was just, up there kind of pouring out her heart. And as somebody who works with a lot of young writers, and sees both the multiple uses of writing, as well as working with fairly precocious young writers who have real skill, I'm just curious about kind of your take on Anne Frank as a writer and her continued relevance in that realm.
Thank you for asking that. First of all, hi, this is so lovely. So to contextualize the Iowa Youth Writing Project's role in this, as all of you are hopefully seeing, beautiful endeavor, we worked with some junior high students over the summer. Kirsten and Megan and another one of their students came up with a curriculum for a 3-part workshop in which students analyzed passages of the diary and worked with those and a bit of historical context, as the undergraduate course did, to write to certain prompts to produce creative writing, fiction, nonfiction, poetry. And one of the questions that grew out of that workshop discussion is one that we're using for this prompt in this contest that we're hoping to reach the entire country with, if we can. So the prompt, the thought is, describe a time when you felt isolated or trapped. How did you work through it, and what did you learn from the experience? And there's a real beauty to the open-endedness of this prompt, specifically in regards to who it's for. So this is a writing contest for teens, junior high students and high school students. And by February 28th, we're looking to have responses to that question in poetry or essay form. And one of the beautiful things about this that we started to see in these workshops, and that we're hoping to see when we do the workshops again in the winter, and then in the responses to this essay prompt, is that students at this age are given to self-exploration in a way that is neither precedented in their lives nor will ever be replicated again. I'll clarify. So whether you're a writer or a reader, we all prefer to have narratives to which we can relate. Writers and readers at the teenage are just a little more honest about it. If you are somebody who's fortunate enough to have a young teen in your life, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They're honest, sometimes almost unto brutality. But really, the early teens can be a time period, at least I've seen working with youth in creative writing, that people lean toward personal narrative. The more imaginative writing styles of early childhood give way to these insight-seeking explorations of personhood, right? And the young person's place within a larger society. And it's, of course, tempered with that idea that we all have when we're adolescents, that maybe our story is inadequate or not interesting, or why would anybody be reading this, right? Which is the question that you just asked, Jennifer, is this just, the heartstrings of a young girl on the page? And Anne actually speaks to that beautifully herself at the very beginning of the diary, if you don't mind my quoting for a moment. She says, and this is like her third entry too, she's already thinking about this. I haven't written for a few days, because I wanted, first of all, to think about my diary. It's an odd idea for someone like me to keep a diary, not only because I've never done so before, but because it seems to me that neither I, nor for that matter anyone else, will be interested in the unbosomings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Still, what does that matter? I want to write, but more than that, I want to bring out all kinds of things that lie buried deep in my heart. There's a saying that paper is more patient than man. It came back to me on one of my slightly melancholy days, while I sat chin in hand, feeling too bored and limp even to make up my mind whether to go out or stay at home. Yes, there's no doubt that paper is patient, and as I don't intend to show this cardboard-covered notebook bearing the proud name of diary to anyone unless I find a real friend, boy or girl, probably nobody cares. And now I come to the root of the matter. The reason for my starting a diary. It is that I have no such real friend. So in this moment, we see so much that's happening in the adolescent mind that renders adolescents the perfect diarists and the perfect people to reflect on their experience as it relates to a greater social arc or a zeitgeist. Nobody is paying attention to a zeitgeist more than your 13-year-old, I guarantee it. And in this excerpt, we see too that crippling self-doubt of nobody is going to read this. I'm alone in the world. You know, there's that wonderful melancholic moment of not even knowing whether she's going to leave the house because, oh, the pain, right? And this is before she's in hiding. This is before any of the events that transpired later in the diary and beyond have. So we see her suffering with this question of, are my words even worthy? And working with IYWP students, it's usually around the age of 12, 13. I hear students issue that heartbreaking sentence, nobody will want to read this. My story is not interesting. And then they sit down to the page and knock you sideways with their insight and wisdom. And, you know, we see exactly this happening in the diary itself. She has this preamble of, I don't have a friend, nobody's listening to me. And then not only does she name 30 people by name who are in fact her friends, but also she begins this diary with a sketch of her life. And in so doing, she sketches the development of the world around her. She mentions that Jews have a curfew. She mentions the certain things that she's not allowed to do that grow in number as the time in the diary goes on. So there's this beautiful interplay in the teenage mind between the personal, the social, the political, that's really apt to capturing this. And something that I find fascinating and just learned a few years ago is that developmentally speaking, a 7th grader has more neuroplasticity than they've ever had at any point since infancy, and it's the most they'll ever have again. So chemically speaking, we are more reflective and intellectually capacious in that moment than we will ever be. And it's why like memories from that time period leap back with such alacrity, even if they're small. You know, and that's why it's so cool, you know, segueing into student response to this and youth reading the diary. That's why it bears such resonant relevance, especially to students who are the same age, especially to students who could have been Anne. And I think, you know, something that we're seeing in engaging with students, both with this diary and, you know, with other diaries and epistolary works that we've used with them at the IYWP, they're astonished that they can relate. And then, you know, because there's so much time, there's gulfs that separate, you know, a student who's 12 in 2021 from Anne Frank, who was 13 at the time of this writing. Yet, you know, it's quite one thing to read this as an adult with a fundamental understanding of the Holocaust, and quite another, you know, as you were saying, Megan, to come into this with not so much knowledge, maybe as a younger person, and really be able to put yourself in the setting. So that's been, I think I tend to bristle at the notion that Anne Frank was anything less than a qualified writer, you know, because particularly as a documentarist of her times, you couldn't find anyone better. Also, from that excerpt, you can tell it's beautiful. It's just beautiful. I mean, yeah.
And yeah, thank you, Mallory. And thank you for helping me understand my own 7th grade self better. Because I was a writer writing very sad poetry at that age. Briefly, and then I very much want to bring in the rabbi's voice, but Kirsten and Megan, from having worked with adolescents over the summer in this workshop, just give us a sense of what they responded to and what they were writing about.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think the students really latched on to this question of confinement. I feel that really resonated with them because, you know, of the moment that we're currently in and coming out of, hopefully, fingers crossed. So their pandemic experience was really relevant and definitely generated additional questions and made them really think about what it's like to have restrictions that we then connected with some of the restrictions that Mallory was talking about. Where have you felt restricted? how does that connect with spatial restriction? And that was definitely, I think, one of the probably most, it generated the most, I think, output from the students, because they were able to really connect their personal experience in the here and the now with the diary itself.
Yeah, and I'll just add a bit. I would say what stood out to me was that a lot of them had actually already journaled before or had been actively doing it. So I thought that was really great, especially given the circumstances and the social isolation that a lot of them were feeling. Just to keep encouraging them to use writing as an outlet, I think was really important on our end.
Great, thank you. So, so we've sort of contextualized, and as a writer, and this connection of bringing this tree to Iowa, and Rabbi, I'm curious about your experience of Anne as now, what's the word, Amsterdamian? I'm not sure. Please help us with that. And I'm just very curious in the notion of Anne Frank in Europe, and particularly in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, and then what you've noticed as maybe different perceptions of Anne Frank in the US.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Questions. So it's Amsterdammer, for what it's worth. That's just how you conjugate it. Yeah, so I was really intrigued by what Mallory was saying about the 7th grade brain, because it totally meshes with the bar and bat mitzvah ceremony that we do around that age. And I'm starting to make some connections there about maybe the neurological relevance of making young Jewish teenagers go through that quite demanding rite of passage. So I'll put that in my toolbox, Mallory. Thank you for that. Yeah, so, for me, Anne Frank was my fellow countrywoman. And I will confess that I have kept a diary since I was about 13. And still do, although I don't write as regularly as I would anymore, given that I have 3 kids and a full-time job, more than full-time job. So, but throughout the decades of my life, I was that person who thought, well, my writing is pretty mediocre or whatever. Of course, personally, I write so much, and I'm confident that I honed that literary voice of mine. But it's interesting, like growing up in post-Holocaust Holland, and almost having self-awareness about documenting history. And of course, the history I documented was, several orders of magnitude less significant or earth-shattering than history. But I had this sense of like being a diarist and having a teenage voice in the written text is legitimate. And I think just growing up with that consciousness, Frank's diary encouraged me to entrust my own thoughts into those notebooks. I don't know. I think there's something to that. The perceptions of Anne Frank, I my mother had critical editions of the diary. A few years she would buy editions where Otto Frank's, the text that Otto Frank had edited out, usually dealing with human sexuality, had been put back in. And I remember my mom talking to us as teenagers about how important it was to have an honest appraisal of who Anne Frank was, and that she was just a normal kid, a teenager with normal lessons under extraordinarily taxing historical circumstances, but with a voice of her own, including puberty, including romance, including that developmentally goes with that. And that just really helped humanize her in my head. There's a statue in Amsterdam of, and so she's always just felt kind of like a constant companion in my life. And of course, when I read the diary, it was super relatable, right? As a diarist myself, and you know, seeing the parallels between those kind of universal struggle for autonomy that I contend with. So for me, she's always just been a human being. And I think that is almost symbolic for how I experienced the post-Holocaust world as a European and as a Dutch woman and as a European Jew and a Dutch Jew versus America, where by virtue of its geographic and temporal distance, the Holocaust acquires a gloss or a sheen that sacralizes it, but that also makes it less relatable in some way. Like, to me, it's the streets walked through every day of my life. On my way to university classes, I would pass the monuments where Jews were deported from. I would, you know, worship in the synagogue, not literally the same building, but the same community that Anne Frank was a member of, where their family were, and their social hall was called the Anne Frank social hall. I have spoken to people who were her friends, you know, and it was just, she was just one of them. Her voice was amplified because of these like that gave her voice wings. I thought about your question about which quote to bring from the diary, and I want to read this one in, it's two quotes. One is a little bit long and the other one short. It's one line, but I want to read them in Dutch, because how can I not Anne Frank, but Anne Frank, you know, and read the quote in the language that she wrote, and I'll translate it for you all, if that is okay. That way, you know, we have this practice in Judaism where we say B'Shora in her name, we teach in someone's name, and, you know, that's part of the transmission in Rabbinic Judaism, and it's very important to always cite yours and quote. So I would like to do that. So our one, both of them have to do with war. And Jennifer, it was your questions in the email to me these quotes, because it shifts the attention away from the kind of quote unquote feel good quotes that people tend to center, and these are for experience. So here's the first one. Is nu eenmaal in de mensen een drang tot vernielen, een drang tot doodslaan, tot vermoorden en razend zijn. There just seems to be within people an urge to destroy, an urge to murder and to be full of rage. En zolang de gehele mensheid zonder uitzondering geen grote metamorfose heeft ondergaan, zal de oorlog woeden. And as long as humankind, exception, undergo a great metamorphosis, then the war, zal alles wat opgebouwd, aangekweekt en gegroeid is, weer afgesneden en vernietigd worden, om daarna opnieuw te beginnen. Then everything that has been rebuilt, that has been planted, that has grown, will be cut off and destroyed again, only to again. So that's one quote. And then the other one sentence, it is: het zijn wij allen die de oorlog willen en er. It is all of us who want the war, accept it. So I just think that brings such wisdom on her part and realism, brings in her experience of the war and her experience, which is so particular to her experience, but also so universal to teenagers. I remember being that age myself, to teenagers who are just completely bemused and flabbergasted and shocked by the complacency of adults to accept things as they are, and they rage against it, and rightly so. We need to rage against it. And so, I think for anyone, for any teenager who is alive at this point in history, where maybe global war, God forbid, chas v'shalom, but we are seeing a global pandemic, seeing climate change and a scorching planet and so much polarization and division. And 2020 and 2021 have been so earth-shattering to so many of us and to so many teenagers as well, that I think this speaks to that experience, right? We are accepting these things, and I think Anne Frank's voice is a voice across time and space to exhort us to not accept those things. And I think that is the best way to honor her memory. Zichronah livracha, may her memory be a blessing.
Thank you. And thank you so much for reading that in the original language. It just takes on such a different meaning and tone. Really, really touching. And what you were just saying actually reminded me very much of one thing Kirsten and I have spoken about and have in kind of our pot of things that we want to eventually cook all the way through is some kind of local mural that honors Anne along with Greta Thunberg and her visit to Iowa City, and because they feel like such twined voices in so many ways.
It's so funny you say that, Jennifer, because as I was finishing my last sentences, I was thinking of Greta Thunberg. So absolutely, yeah. Very intuitive.
Yeah, thank you. So this next question, I'm gonna start it with Kirsten, but Rabbi and certainly Mallory and Megan, if you'd like, please join in. So this is a slightly thornier question, but I really feel that it is important as we think about how Anne is portrayed and remembered and her relevance. So there have been questions raised about the veneration of this young woman and her memory. And there's a new collection of essays out by a Jewish American author named Dara Horn. And the book is, I think, intentionally provocatively titled "People Love Dead Jews." The very first essay in the collection comes from an article that first appeared in Smithsonian Magazine. It's very easy to find online called "Becoming Anne Frank." And it starts actually with an anecdote about recently a Jewish worker at the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam who was asked to cover his yarmulke because museum administrators were uncomfortable with it. And she talks about how other diarists whose work dealt more bluntly with the horrors of the Holocaust are not known, but how Frank, hidden as she was while writing the diary from the extremities of the brutality, could write something like, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." And Horn writes, "The gift of grace and absolution from a murdered Jew, exactly the gift, it is worth noting, at the heart of Christianity, is what millions of people are so eager to find in Frank's hiding place, in her writings, in her legacy. It is far more gratifying to believe that an innocent dead girl has offered us grace than to recognize the obvious. Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who were not." And so just reflecting on Dorn's argument, sentiment that Frank's appeal lies in the fact that she perhaps doesn't force readers to examine some of the horrors And Kirsten, I know we've already talked about this, so if you could start, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, it is definitely a difficult, thorny question. I think one could acknowledge that Anne's account, if, in some ways, I guess I partly agree with Horn. One could acknowledge that Anne's account is a more sanitized version of history, but it is so by virtue of necessity. Anne was forced into hiding, and she wrote from the confines of the annex space. Her diary stops, cold stop. And her diary does not address the camps. It does not address the suffering in the camps, the inhumaneness of the Nazis. But the fact that it doesn't, that's not an artificial omission. It is what happened because her outlook in hiding was limited. But what I think, instead of looking at that as a detriment to her text, is her text serves as this really unique portal, as this entryway for many of these other stories that need to be read and listened to. And that includes those from the past and those from today. I think, what we've talked about already in this conversation is Anne writes in a personal manner. She addresses each entry to Kitty. There's an addressee in her writing. This type of writing speaks to readers directly. People can connect with her experiences, her emotions, her space. We all know the horrors that follow her final entry of August 1st, 1944. But her writing still appeals to this human spirit of compassion. And the other, if we look at history texts or statistics, we don't know who's at the other end of that number. In reading Anne, we develop a relationship. So sure, as Horn argues, Anne's story might be more palatable, but it doesn't weaken her message. And I'm also thinking Anne hid in a closed space for 2+ years. How is that not horrific? And the terrors that she mentions may not include the brutality that we know of, but in their own right, her life and respective fears were genuine, and in that sense are part of history. It's a primary account. It's telling us that moment in time.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to Rabbi and then Mallory.
That I am just a rabbi. I'm not a historian. I'm not a historian of the Holocaust. I think it's really important that in the humanization of Anne Frank, we see that she is a part of the puzzle, a very large puzzle of a very large range, complex Holocaust experiences. And I just think it's really important to let those experiences speak for themselves, to let them be used for whatever agenda, just the memory of people who underwent those experiences. There's been a lot of discourse in the well, right? There used to be this historiography of Black versus white, the evil Nazis, and then the Dutch resisted the Nazis. And well, not all the Dutch resisted the Nazis. A lot of the Dutch collaborated with the Nazis, passively or even actively. And so in Holland, there's been a reckoning with this history, you know, which they call a gray history, right? In between the black and the white, a gray history of, we need to learn to talk about this broad range. So while the Shoah was, you know, devastating and earth-shattering for everyone, some people were relatively safe in hiding. Other people were at the other end of the experience. And what I witnessed is that people have processed these experiences very differently. You know, having been honored to be part of the survivor community, obviously not as a survivor myself, but having borne witness to the elders in my Jewish community who have processed this in different ways and sometimes shared with me how they processed it, and sometimes chosen not to share that. Some people would say, I'm quite happy to talk about it, it's important to talk about it. Other people said I can't talk about it. I think that we should meet Anna where she is at, as a teenage girl who was crushed by the juggernaut of history, but just with her talents that I'm sure, had she lived, would have developed in some. But a kid who was part of this historical juncture and whose very power lies in that humanity of her message, because it is such a universal message, right? And not because she is an Ilui, as we say in Hebrew, you know, a genius, a remarkable person, but because she was a good kid. And, you know, I think we should always, in that gap between history and memory, history for the scholars and memory is for the heart, right? And how we remember, we should be humble in terms of what we hope to attain with that remembrance, and subvert the humanity of those we remember in service of memory, if that makes sense. As for your question, Jennifer, you know, it's interesting. Through the you know, we are all going through a type of collective trauma with the pandemic. Obviously, lahavdil, as we, you know, clearly making a difference, wanting to differentiate with the Shoah, Holocaust. We are going through this pandemic collective trauma, and you know, we know from personal experience that people can have delayed responses to trauma, right? And that as you're undergoing the trauma, you're just trying to survive. Imagine not being a psychologist, again, I'm just a rabbi, but as you are undergoing that, and I think after 2020, it's a little more relatable for me. You're just hanging, trying to be positive, and that human psychological in Anna Frank should not be parsed for ideological reasons, right? Kids are resilient, kids are idealistic. She was trying to hold on. She didn't have all the facts. She didn't know what we know. And, you know, had Anna survived, what would she have said about her own Holocaust trauma 20, 30, 40, 50 years later? We will never know, right? But I think we have to acknowledge that this is a snapshot, frozen in time, of a girl under duress who's just trying the very best she can to survive and to keep going. And that should never be interpreted in some kind of, you know, dare I say, logical way, right? This idea that she would be the voice, offer absolution for the crimes of the Holocaust, because people are good at heart. Yeah, she believes people are good at heart. She was a kid who did not have all the information. It's testimony to her resilience. It's not testimony to an absolution of the midnight of the century. It's just testimony to who Anna Frank was. And sometimes I think we should just do that in honor of her own memory.
Mallory?
That was beautifully put, Rabbi Hugenholtz. I agree completely. And I think really where I take issue here with Horn's critique is in the notion that to believe in the fundamental goodness of people is somehow Pollyanna-ish, misled, or weak. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and they, after the war, believed in the fundamental goodness of people more than anybody else I've ever encountered. My grandmother was just the sweetest. She got taken advantage of a lot because of this, but she believed in the fundamental goodness of people. And that's why she taught. That's why she went into the communities to share her story and to make it public and to hope that people learn from it. If we don't believe in the fundamental goodness of people, we can't teach. And I think that the notion that we can carry away from Anne Frank's testimony here is not that we should all go wide-eyed into the world thinking that everybody is going to give us flowers, but that every human has a grain of something that can learn, that can progress, that can go forward. And something that I've noted in everybody's comments here is the way that we're using this narrative, whether it's with children, community members, university students, as a way to plot the future. And I think that, in reading this, not in isolation, of course, as Rabbi Hugenholtz mentioned, but reading this, it's a lot easier for somebody to take this and go forward with a message of hope and of, working across communities than just reading a straight, dire account that leaves no room for light at the end.
Great, Megan, and then we're going to be closing out. Megan,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on to kind of what was said about it having an impact on youth and being a way that we can teach young people about this event without having to maybe expose them to the up close version of things right away. And I think we saw that in our workshop. And I think it really does build empathy in young kids to hear about and relate to a story about, as Rabbi said, an ordinary girl living through history. And I think it also gives way to the future, since young people are our future. And hopefully that her story can have an impact on a younger audience as well.
Great. Thank you. So we are at close. Kirsten, it sounds like you have one very short thing.
I just wanted to, I have a quote that might sum up.
Okay, thank you.
What Cal said. It's a short quote. Anne wrote, "I don't think of all the misery, but of the beauty that still remains."
Thank you. And I do want to add somewhat, I think as a writer, I feel I think we're maybe taking some of Horn's intention a little out of context, and I have been reading extremely positive reviews of this book, so I'm eager to read it myself. I read this one essay, but I hope that others will check it out, and I'm sure the public library has a copy, or it's coming soon, right, Jason? So at any rate, I'm very apologetic that we don't have time for questions. We filled up every ounce of our time, but the wonderful thing is that there will be various events occurring throughout the year and beyond as we move towards the April 29th planting ceremony. There is a website, UI on AnneFrank.com, I believe that's correct. And so I hope that you'll check out events there. All four of you who spoke today so warmly, graciously from your hearts, I really, really appreciate you being here. And thank you to everybody who attended this evening.